I recently put out a series on working with the YouTube API and PHP, and I had a viewer comment request that I talk about this process in the context of a Laravel application. So that's what I'm going to do in this video. I'm actually going to be referencing some of the notes I provided as part of this series and just follow them along and show the process in Laravel. Now keep in mind, this is really almost an addendum to this series in that I'm not going to be walking through each step in detail of what we're doing. I'm just going to be quickly adapting it and showing it within Laravel. So if you've never worked with YouTube API and PHP before, I recommend actually watching through that series before you get to this point. It'll help things make a little bit more sense. All right, so that's the plan. Let's jump right in. I've got a basic Laravel application up and running on my local server. And the only thing I've done in here so far is I just created a demo controller. I've got an index method, and you could see that my main route on this application is pointing to that. So that's what we're seeing in the browser. All right, now to integrate the YouTube API into this, let's go pull up the notes for the first video in this series. So I'm going to go to the initial setup video, and let's go ahead and grab the link to the notes. And scrolling down here for the instructions, one of the first things we have to do is to set up a new project in the Google Cloud Console. So let's go over there and do that. So I'll click this drop down, say new project, call it demo-laravel, create that. Select it as my active project. Just make sure that's active in the drop down here. And then returning to our steps, let's see what we need to do next. All right, so next we can generate a API key. So we're going to go into our API and services. I've got a quick link to that down here. I'm going to go over to credentials, create credentials. We'll create a new API key. We'll copy that. And then in our application, I want to set this up as an environment config. So the first thing I'm going to do is go into my configs, and we'll go into our app config and put it here. And we'll create a new config. I'll call it YouTube API key. And we're going to set it to whatever is in our environment variable for that value. And then I'll leave it as a blank value by default. All right, so now in my environment file, we'll define that, and I'll just put that, well, let's put it closer to the top. And then paste in that key we got from YouTube. And just to make sure that's working, let's go back to our controller and make sure we can access that variable. So I'm just going to dump it to the page. This is going to pull from our config. It's going to be app, YouTube, API key. Perfect. All right, so coming back to the notes, our next step is we need to enable the YouTube API within the Cloud Console. So jumping back to that page, go to Enabled APIs and Services, click this button. I'm going to search for YouTube. Choose the YouTube Data API v3. Enable it. And then go back to the notes and see what our next step is. And it looks like we're ready to jump into the code. The first thing we need to do is pull in this external Google API PHP client package that we're going to be using. So we'll do that with a composer require command. So in command line in the root of my project, I will run that command. And then with that installed, coming back to the notes, the next suggestion was to add this var dumper package from Symfony. That was only applicable when we were working outside of Laravel, so we had a way to quickly dump some variable data to the screen. But now that we're in Laravel, we have access to the global dump helper, so we don't actually need to complete that step. So skipping that and right down to the code, we want to pull in this code example, but we're going to omit the require statement at the top that pulls in Composer's auto-loading file. That's not something we need to do because Laravel handles that for us when it bootstraps the application. We are going to need these use statements though. This is going to give us access to the classes we're going to be using within the Google API PHP client. So let's make sure we've got them at the top of the controller file. And then let's pull in the code sample that's actually communicating with the API. All right, you can see it is expecting our API key as one of the variables. So again, I'm going to grab that from my config. And I can leave everything else as written in the example. I talked in detail in the initial series about what this code is doing, but just a quick recap. The first thing we have to do is create a new client class from that Google API PHP client library. We have to initialize our API key using the set developer key method. And then once we've got that client set up, we're going to create a new instance of the YouTube service with that client. And that's what's going to give us access to the YouTube API methods. Now, in this example, the method we're looking at is the ability to list videos from the API. We're passing it 2 arguments. The first is what details we want to get back for the given videos. In this case, we're requesting the snippet details, so it's going to have things like the title, description, tags, etc. And then we're looking for a specific video based on the ID. And this is just hard-coded with one of my video IDs. You could swap this out with any public video ID when you're playing around with this example. All right, that should give us a response from the YouTube API, and then we just dump it to the page so we could take a look at it. So let's run this in the browser. And you can see we're getting a video list response back. Within there, we have an items attribute. If we expand on that, we see we have a single response back of a video object. And if we expand on that and dig into its details, coming down here under snippet, we've got a video snippet object. And there's the details we're actually looking for. You can see things like the description, title, so on and so forth. All right, so that's the full response. If we wanted to narrow things down, we could say response items. In this case, we're requesting a single video. We know we're going to have a single item response, so we're going to say items at 0. And we're going to go into the snippet details, and let's just grab the title. And with that, that's a really basic example of just retrieving some data from the YouTube API. And if you go back to the series contents and look at parts 2 and 3, you'll see very similar examples to that. It just goes into a little bit more detail on what we can do with the video details, how to get multiple videos back, how to page through results. But the basic setup of using that code within Laravel is the same. So I'm not going to go through those 2 parts. I do want to jump ahead to part 4, setting up an OAuth connection, because this allows us to actually write data to the YouTube server. So I want to make sure I cover that in this video. All right, so jumping into that, the first thing we have to do to set up an OAuth connection is we've got to go back to that, the Google Cloud Console and do some configuration, starting with setting up an OAuth consent screen. So switching back to that tab, let's go over to the OAuth consent screen. We can choose whether we intend this application to be used internally within our organization or publicly externally. I'm going to choose external and say create. And then I'm going to customize what my consent screen is going to look like. This is the screen that our users see when they're going to request authentication with the YouTube API on behalf of our site. So we're going to fill it in with our site info. I'm just going to call it demo. I'm going to put in the email address. It is going to force you to use the email address of whatever Google account you're logged in as for this project. If this was not just a demo, I would definitely want to upload my app logo at this point, as well as fill in whatever details I had for the app domain. This is all just going to provide extra information and context for the user on the consent screen and just lend authenticity to the request that you're making. But for the purposes of this demo, I'm going to skip past that and get down to authorized domains. And here I want to add the domain that the Google servers are going to redirect back to after the consent is granted. Now, if I was working on the production version of my application right now, I would very simply just enter my production domain. For example, let's imagine this was running on demo.com. That would work. However, right now I'm working on my development server where the extension for my domain is demo.test. And as you can see, that's not going to validate. It says invalidate domain must be a top private domain. It doesn't like this .test extension. It's expecting something like .com, .net, whatever. Now, as I discussed in the original series, the way we're going to get around this in development is we're going to use a service called redirectme2.com. This service allows you to use their domain, which does have a valid top-level domain, and just redirect to any URL you want to indicate. So for example, to see this in action, let me just pull up a new tab. So if I go to redirectme2.com, but I append on my URL to it, ultimately it's just going to redirect the user back to my URL. All right, so we're going to use that for development purposes to get to our local testing development domain while still satisfying the requirement they have here of this top-level domain. And like I said, if you had a production environment in which you were going to be running this application, you would want to include that domain here as well. So just to simulate that, I will add demo.com. And then finally, it wants a developer contact email. So I'll just go ahead and enter that. Let's click Save and Continue. And that leads us to scopes. This is where we're going to indicate what actions we want access to do on the YouTube API on behalf of the requesting user. So let's see what our options are. We're going to narrow this down to YouTube-related scopes. And you could skim through the different options, but you want to choose the scopes that are appropriate for whatever your application is trying to do. In our example, we're going to be editing a video on YouTube. So the scope I want to choose is the ability to manage a YouTube account. So I'm going to check that off. That's all I need access to in this example. And I'm going to say update. And then if I scroll down, I should see that scope listed. And then if I go further down, I can say save and continue. And then under test users, because this project is still in testing mode, we do have to explicitly indicate which Google users are going to be able to test it. So I'm going to add one of my Google accounts. And the key thing is just that because we're testing YouTube functionality, I want to make sure that this is an account that I have associated with YouTube. I have some videos on this account, so I'll be able to play around with the API features. All right, so I'm going to add that, save and continue. And then we should be all set with our OAuth consent screen. So now the next thing we want to do is go back to credentials, and we're going to create another set of credentials. Previously, we created API keys. Now we need some OAuth client IDs. So let's create that. We're going to indicate our application type. In this case, it's a web application. We give it a name. This is just for identifying it in the dashboard, so you can call it whatever you want. I'll just leave it as the default. We're not doing any JavaScript requests for this application, so I'm going to leave this blank. For authorized redirect URLs, this ties back to what I was talking about earlier with authorized domains. Here we want to indicate which URL Google is going to redirect back to after authorization is granted. So just as I was discussing earlier in our example here, it's going to be redirect me to .com/demo.test. And of course, I should mention, if you were writing this code via a route that wasn't just the root of your domain, you would want to indicate that here. So let's say I was setting things up under /YouTube. That's the URL I would want to use. But in my case, everything is coming from the root, so I'm just going to leave it as my root domain. All right, let's go ahead and create our credentials. And then I'm going to choose the option to download the resulting credentials as a JSON data file. And then I'm going to find that in my downloads folder and rename it to just youtube.json. And then I need to bring this into my Laravel code base. So let me bring up my code editor, drag that over. And then in terms of where I'm going to place this file, I'm just going to put it in the root of the project. I'm going to treat it very similarly to our .env or environment files in that it contains sensitive credentials. We have things like our client secret in there. So not something we want to be tracking in, say, our version control repository. We don't want this ending up on GitHub. So we are going to manually manage this file, and it is something that might vary depending on different contexts, just like our environment file. So like this might be the configs that are specific to the testing version of this application. And then when I eventually deploy this under production context, I might create a separate project and set of credentials for that context. So at that point, I would place the appropriate youtube.json file in that context. That's my thought process. No hard rules. You won't find this in the Laravel documentation that says where to put a file like this. I guess the other option is we could put it in our config directory, but all the files in there follow a very specific pattern when it comes to working with Laravel configs, and they are tracked in version control. So I don't think it's appropriate there. So like I said, I'm just going to treat it as like a environment file. And actually applying that, let's make sure we go into our git ignore file. And just like we ignore our environment files from our repo, we also want to ignore this file. So I'm just going to add that. So with our configs all set up, coming back to the notes, let's check out our next step. We've already done all this stuff with the consent screen. I'm going to go all the way down and take a look at the sample code for using this consent process. All right, so here's the code. And just like our previous example, we can omit the auto loading line for Composer. Laravel takes care of that for us. We are going to be using sessions in this code, but that is also something that Laravel sets us up with. So we're going to omit the session start line. We've already got our use statement for the Google client. So I'm going to get everything after that for our sample. And let's bring that in. We do have some output in HTML. I'll set up a view for that. So I'm going to not grab that right yet. I'm just going to grab this code and bring it into my controller. So I'll replace our existing example with this code. And let's skim through here to understand the process and also understand what we have to change to make this work in the context of Laravel. All right, so the first thing we do is define the redirect URL. As we talked about previously, this is just the URL that Google is going to send the user back to after they've authenticated. It's going to include their token data we're going to use for the authentication process. We create a new client using the Google API PHP client. We set our auth config, and here we need to reference the youtube.json file. Now we need to make sure that the path to this file is correct in this Laravel context. And the way I'm going to get that is just wrap this in the base path helper. All right, that should generate a full path to that YouTube JSON file that we placed in the base of our project. After that, we indicate our redirect URL using the set redirect URI method on the client. And then we want to invoke the add scope method on the client for any of the scopes we're going to be requesting access to. And this should correlate with the scopes you set up when designing your consent screen. All right, now what follows after that is 4 different scenarios or sections of code to handle basically 4 different situations we might be in when this page is loaded. Situation 1 is when we're not yet authenticated with the YouTube API. It's going to detect that we're not authenticated. It's going to come up with a URL we can use to follow to start the authentication process. Scenario 2 is going to complete the authorization. This will be triggered when we're redirected back from the Google servers after going through the consent process. Scenario 3 is going to determine or detect when we've already authenticated. At that point, we will have some token data in our session, and it will re-authenticate us using that existing data. And then scenario 4 exists if we want to terminate our connection with the API. Now, I know that was a very broad overview of what this code is doing because I don't want to waste too much time going through the specifics. I already talked about that in part 4 of the original series. So definitely revisit that if you want to understand in detail what this code is doing. Here, I just want to focus on, well, what do we need to do to get this to work in Laravel? And out of the box, this should actually work as I've pasted it over, but I am going to optimize it for Laravel because there's definitely some Laravel helpers we could be taking advantage of. For example, in this line, we're looking to see if we have a query string called code, and we're using PHP's global get helper for that. And we could switch over and do this via the Laravel request object. So let's make sure we have that accessible within this method. And we'll need a use statement up top. And then we'll update this line to use that request object. Specifically, we'll use the has method to check and see if we have a code query string. And similarly, anywhere we're using PHP's session superglobal, we can switch over to Laravel session facade. So let me make sure we have that accessible within this file. And then I'll update this line. And here we're actually looking for the absence of that value in the session, so I'm going to negate this with a exclamation point. Now I do want to pause just for a moment to recognize that I am glossing over these Laravel tools that I'm using, because the assumption is you're coming to this video to just work with the YouTube API in Laravel context. You're not coming here to learn Laravel for the first time. So I am making some assumptions about what you know. That being said, if there's any questions about these methods I'm using and how they work in Laravel, just leave a comment below and I'm happy to dig deeper and elaborate. But powering forward, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to refactor the rest of the code doing similar things. Anywhere we're using the session superglobal or the get superglobal, I'm just going to replace that with the Laravel way of doing things. The other thing I'm going to refactor as I'm going through here is any of the redirects. Currently, I'm using PHP's header method, but we can replace that by returning Laravel's redirect method, and we'll just pass it our redirect URL. And there's one other place where we're doing a redirect, so I'm going to replace it there as well. And now that all of my PHP logic is optimized for Laravel, the last thing I want to pull over is just the output code that came at the end. Let's put this in a view file. So in my resources, views subdirectory, I'm going to create a new, we'll just call it demo.blade.php file and paste in that view code. And because we're working in Blade, we can go ahead and use Blade syntax instead of straight PHP syntax. And just skimming over this code, you could see what's going on. So if we are currently connected, we're going to let the user know that and give them the option to disconnect. If we're not connected, we're going to let the user know that and then give them the option to connect by linking them over to the auth URL. So connected and auth URL, these are two bits of data we need to make sure that this view has. So back in the demo controller, the last thing we're going to do in this index method is we're going to return that view, and we're going to pass along those bits of data. So I'll set this up as an array. We'll have our connected data. We're going to set that to whatever our connected variable ended up being in the steps above. And then we'll also pass along the auth URL, which again is something that is set in the logic above. Up here in scenario 1, if we're preparing for authorization, this is where we generate the auth URL. Now in the other scenarios, we won't have an auth URL, and I want to make sure my view doesn't error out when we don't have this data. So using the null coalescing operator, I'm just going to set a default value of null if we don't have the auth URL, just to prevent any errors in the view. All right, so I think we're ready to test this out. Let's load this in the browser. All right, so our status output is we are not currently authorized. Here's our auth URL link. So if we click that, it's going to begin the authorization process over on the Google servers. First thing we have to do is choose the account we want to authorize as, and you want to make sure you choose one of the test accounts that you had indicated when you set up your OAuth consent screen. Then on the next page, it's just going to let you know that the app you're connecting with is currently in testing mode, so we're just going to say continue. And then finally, we get to the actual consent step, where you should see any of the scopes you had indicated listed here. So the user would hopefully click continue. And then it sends us back to our redirect URL. You can see we're currently authorized. This pop-up is just from my password manager, so I'm going to dismiss that. All right, and this should persist. So if I were to say open this in a new tab, it still sees I'm authorized because it's just looking at my session data. And then if I want, I could disconnect. And now I'm back to my state of not being authorized. Now to wrap this up, now that we've got the OAuth connection set up, the last thing we did in the YouTube API and PHP series was we saw how we could edit a video on YouTube once we had that OAuth connection. So jumping over to those notes, this is going to be in part 5. We want to do the same thing here. We want to make sure we can actually use this OAuth connection. So once again, going to grab the code from there, just adapt it for our Laravel context. And just like in our previous example, I don't need the session start, I don't need the auto load requirement, and I don't need these use statements. I already have them in my controller. So I'm just going to grab the key parts of this code. And I'm actually going to set this up in a separate method from our index method, just to keep things divided so I don't have a ton of logic in my index method. I'll have one for doing the OAuth process, and then I'll have one for editing a video. So let me add the edit method at the end. And you could skim through and read the comments as for what is happening, and of course refer back to the actual video where I constructed this code. But just to summarize, I've hard-coded a video or the ID of a video that we want to edit, and I set a new title for that video. Then I go ahead and set up my classes to communicate with the API. Here's where I'm checking for an existing OAuth token. If we don't have that, we send the user over to the index page. Otherwise, if we do have it, we can assume that we can go ahead and communicate with the API and do the edit. So I've got the methods necessary to do that. I first have to query the API to get the existing video details. I update those details, and then I persist those changes. And in this case, I didn't have any sort of HTML output. I just dumped the data directly to the page. So I'm going to keep this example simple and just leave those dump statements in there to test this. But I do want to refactor this for Laravel in the same way that I did my edit method. So I'll go through that process again here. And it looks like we're all set. There wasn't a lot to refactor in that example. All right, so let's set up a web route so we can actually trigger this method. And then let's test it out. So I'm just manually going to go to edit, and it actually redirects me back to the index because I'm not currently authorized. Last I had been in this tab, I had disconnected. So let's reconnect so we can get to that edit page. All right, so now we're reconnected. Let's try to go to edit again. And the output we're producing is 2 video snippets, basically the before and after. So here was the video details before the edit. And what we are changing is the title. So this is what the title looked like before the edit. And then this snippet represents what the video looked like after the edit. And you can see our title was updated. I just added 3 ellipses at the end of that title. All right, and again, that's just coming from the code. Here's where we set the title. So if I wanted to say set it back to what it originally was, I could just update this, come back and refresh this. All right, and now you could see the before had the 3 ellipses and the after does not have that. And let me just load this video on YouTube just to make sure that the changes we're seeing here are reflected there as well. So let me grab that video ID. And we'll pause Ryan Reynolds and yeah, just confirm that that title matches what we've currently got it set to. All right, now that was obviously a quick and dirty example where we've just hard-coded the video details. We just dumped the raw data to the page, but you can imagine how you could expand on this. Maybe you have a form where you're collecting the new title. Maybe you have a list of videos the user can choose from their account. You could expand this however you see fit, but the basic idea of how we actually persisted the edit to the YouTube API is demonstrated. So with that, I'm going to wrap up this example. Hopefully this was helpful if you followed along with that YouTube API and PHP series and was curious how you would apply those same concepts in Laravel. And as always, check out the notes that accompany this video. All the code that I showed in the video will be provided there, so you can copy and paste and reference that as needed.